Michael, we got to get to more of the serious topic here in the NFL, and that is surrounding Cleveland Browns quarterback Deshaun Watson. The NFL Wednesday decided to appeal Deshaun Watson's 6-game suspension that was originally issued by Judge Sue L. Robinson. Sue L. Robinson was the independent disciplinary officer appointed by both the NFL and NFLPA. And some of the factual findings, important to note, of Robinson's report and ruling are binding and may not be appealed throughout this appeals process. Judge Robinson found that Watson violated the NFL's personal conduct policy on 3 different accounts. Now, Roger Goodell, the commissioner of the NFL, will have a chance to either appeal or appoint somebody to appeal this case here. But all the information that's on the table, and we'll get into a lot of it throughout this discussion here, Michael, your initial thoughts here to the appeal that we heard less than 24 hours ago from the NFL.
You know, Femi, we can learn a lot from pop culture movies. Do you remember the Good Will Hunting in the opening scene where, he beats up that guy in the playground and they take him to court, and he's sitting on the court and he represents himself. Matt Damon represents himself, and he starts citing prior cases to get himself off. Mm-hmm. And those prior cases, they go back to the 1700s or whatever it is. It's in the law. And that's what law is, prior cases, precedent. Like what has happened in the past, what is moving forward, what is the precedent in this area? Judges want to use precedent. The problem with this ruling is because of the NFL's been all over the place. 4 games for Tom Brady, for deflating footballs. Never did it, but 4 games for it, right? $1 million to Kraft, right? Was never proven, but they did it. And then arbitrarily 6 games for steroid violation, but then 6 games for these accounts. Like there's been no structure. There has been no criteria. There has been no precedent set. So when she didn't know what to do. She literally didn't know what to do. She didn't know and she wants to be able to cite X versus thing in July as a case, right? She wanted to be able to cite that, and she couldn't. And so, therefore, she came up with 6 games. And the NFL's all pissed off about it because it's not a year. Well, the NFL should be pissed off at themselves because they have never uniformed the personal conduct in terms of what is expected. Like, if you know you are going to do something and here's the penalty, I'm not saying you won't do it. I'm just saying you got to understand the consequences. Right? And so because we have no standard criteria, we're all over the place. It's the reason why the Hall of Fame's so screwed up. And I write about it in my new book. There's no criteria for entrance, for coaches, for executives, for players. It's just an arbitrary, I think this guy's the best player. I think Ray Lewis is the best linebacker ever to play. Nobody ever paid attention to whether Buckus was good or any of that. None of that, right? It's just arbitrary. So when you have an arbitrary process, you have no precedent. I think this is what you get.
Yeah, and in the appeals process, from the reports that we've been reading throughout the past 36 hours or so, it sounds like the NFL is seeking an indefinite suspension or a year-long suspension for Watson. Now, it's an interesting situation because the NFL, like you mentioned, Sue Robinson, she put out the evidentiary report there in her ruling, and she pretty much shows that Watson just violated these 3 accounts there of the personal conduct policy. But like you mentioned, she didn't really know what to do from a suspension standpoint. So she almost put the ball back in the NFL's court of like, hey, you guys, in a sense, figure this out. And then if you have to go to court, it'll be figured out then. But as of now, the NFL is hoping that they can get that year-long suspension, which I'd imagine this appeal is going to be heard by Roger Goodell. We haven't seen that indicated or that hasn't been reported, but something of this high profile and this serious of a nature, it probably is going to stop at Goodell. Don't you think, Michael?
Well, I mean, how does it not? Like, just say Goodell says, Troy Vincent, you oversee it, right? And you have, like, Goodell's going to be involved. I mean, you can't be you can't pull an Al Davis here. The key with Al Davis used to love to be behind the curtain, the wizard, working on different things, and then please and applaud. I had nothing to do with it. I had nothing to do with that. I'm just here watching the games. Everybody knows you had a lot to do with it, right? And probably was for a good thing at one time. But you might as well stand in front. That's what leadership is about. You stand in front when things aren't going good. If you send Troy Vincent out there to make the call and you're going to meddle behind the scenes, I think you've got a lot of problems. So for me, For me, I think he should just come out and say, I'm taking this over. This is in my jurisdiction, and I'm going to hear it. Now, they can't present different evidence. All he can do is impose a different. Now, what he's got to be careful of is we know if he goes a year, this is going to go to court. So what's happening today, and I don't have proof of this, but what's happening today is simply this. Lawyers are negotiating.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what goes on. They're negotiating some form. Is it going to be 8? Is it going to be 12? Is it going to be 10? Is it going to be 7? I think that's kind of where it is right now. And I think Goodell would like to get a settlement so he doesn't lose his authority in the courts that's been collectively bargained.
The negotiation to me, I think, is really interesting because we saw the reports before the prior 6-game suspension that the NFL offered Watson a 12-game suspension with a near $10 million fine. That was from Sports Illustrated. Also, the NFL, we saw the report that they wanted the indefinite suspension. It sounded like Watson's camp was only willing to do 6 to 8 games, which is why we saw when the initial 6-game suspension came out, Watson's camp did not appeal. And the NFLPA put that out Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening, saying that we are going to respect whatever Judge Sue L. Robinson comes down with tomorrow morning, almost indicating that they probably knew that it was going to be a 6-game suspension around where they felt comfortable. But Watson's camp didn't appeal the initial suspension, which I think is an interesting point as well here. But in terms of the negotiating, do you think that they end up getting something done here over the next couple of weeks? Because you think that Roger Goodell might be in jeopardy of losing some of this power here that was collectively bargained in the 2020 new CBA.
Well, they've had difficulty when they've gone to court. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. Brady took them to court too, right? Brady took them, and that didn't work out for Brady. But there's been other cases where it has worked out for the player. So, if it gets into court, I think it's anyone's guess. But I think what they're going to rely on is that Sue Robinson, an arbitrary judge appointed by the league with no relationship with the league office or with the Players Association, ruled that he did violate this. And because he violated this, he is now subject to some form of penalty. And because of their own mess that they've created by not having a standardized disciplinary action for this, they are now subjected to what she gave 6 games. So it's their mess. They got to clean it up, fam. That's what it is. And if you're the Cleveland Browns, I think today that, there's a good chance that he's going to go more than – there's a really good chance he's going to go more than 6. We know that. However, if it gets into the courts and it gets appealed, then I think he could play after 6 games, serve 6, and keep playing. Or maybe he plays anyway until they come to some consensus. I think that's the fundamental question that I can't answer.
Yeah, and I think that's an important one because I think a lot of folks now are thinking back to Tom Brady in his case with the Deflategate stuff, Ezekiel Elliott in his case, what was being accused against him there. And both of them were able to get the temporary restraining order or the preliminary injunction to continue to play while it was playing out through the court system. But I saw Mike Florio, and I'll give him the tip of the cap here. He pointed this out there that because Watson and his camp didn't appeal the initial 6-game suspension, any sort of injunction or a restraining order that the NFLPA would file wouldn't necessarily kick in until week 7, which would be the point to where which Watson doesn't believe that he should be suspended. So if there's no ruling that's came down from federal court until that point, then we might see Deshaun Watson back on the field. But prior to that, it sounds like he's still going to miss those first 6 games, regardless what happens through the appeals or what happens with him going to federal court, which seems like that's going to be the case if the lengthy suspension we're all anticipating comes of this appeal.
Yeah, I mean, look, when it comes to the courts, it's anyone's rule. It has to be precedent, and certainly in these cases, we don't have it. So, if you're the Browns, I think to me, you've got to really prepare yourself for the fact that this is going to drag on for a while. Now, the league says it's not. The league says they're going to make a timely decision. So I would suspect, Goodell's, when he appealed, he has to know what he wants to do. I really feel like he, as the commissioner, as somebody in charge, as the face of the league, he needs to step in front of this and say, I'm leading it. Like, I'm leading it. This is my call.
Yeah. What do you ultimately think happens here? Because I know if the Browns are probably maybe coming up with contingency points and all that stuff or of what they could potentially do if they're missing Watson for a lengthy amount of time here. What do you think happens? I mean, it's hard to guess right now, but if you could do your best guess, what do you think ends up happening when this all plays out?
I got to think he gets 12 games. I think he's going to get – I think that if the league is going to hold on to a year, I think maybe does he settle for 12? Double what Sue Robinson came up with? I'm sure it really comes down to what is your best case? Like, all these things. You remember the scene in the great movie Zero Dark 30 where they're all sitting around the table and James Gandolfini, who's playing the director of the CIA, Leon Panetta, and he asked them for the probability of is Bin Laden in the house, and nobody other than the woman, she went 99.9% he's in there, and they all got a gas, right? So what's happening in both NFLPA offices and the NFL offices is the same thing. They got a bunch of lawyers in the room. Goodell's saying, what's our probability of winning this in court if we just go ahead and suspend him for a year? And they're all going to say 70-30, 65-20, like they did in Zero Dark 30. And in the NFLPA, they're saying the same thing. So they're calculating what their risk reward is. And based on that is what we'll see towards a negotiation. If the PA thinks they're going to lose, they'll settle for the 12. If the NFL thinks they're going to lose, maybe they'll settle for the 10. I think it's all part of what's the strength of your case in terms of when it gets to court.
I think a lot of people, when they hear about the appeals and the appeal being heard by either Roger Goodell or somebody that he appoints to hear that appeal, a lot of folks have the question of what is the point of the independent disciplinary officer? I know Watson's camp has that question as well here.
Me too.
What do you think is
Why not?
It's because that was negotiated in the CBA? Because essentially it's the same situation of Goodell hearing and getting the final word in these disciplinary hearings.
Yeah, I mean, look, to me, I have the same. If you're going to give it to her and then you're going to change her ruling, now what she did for him was she gave him a lot of credibility if it gets to the court. Yes. Because she is an independent arbitrator, he can go to the courts and say, look, this is what's in my right by the CBA. I don't feel she imposed enough of a disciplinary action, but the evidence is here to prove that I have every right to do what I'm doing. That's a powerful tool right there.
Yeah, and I think it's important just to put out what she had in the evidentiary record there in her findings, because when you read that, it's gonna hold. I feel like, in my opinion, it's gonna side with what the NFL wants in getting a longer suspension, because the stuff is out there. It's a little graphic, and this is some of the findings that she had in her evidentiary record there. She said, with respect to whether the contact was intentional, the matter of intent generally must be inferred from circumstantial evidence in the absence of an admission. In this case, Mr. Watson reached out to women whose professional qualifications were unknown and unimportant to him. He insisted on using a towel, increasing the probability of exposure. He insisted on having the therapist focus on areas of his body that not uncommonly triggered erections, and he engaged in this pattern of conduct multiple times. I find this sufficient circumstantial evidence to support the NFL's contention not only that contact occurred, but that Mr. Watson was aware that contact probably would occur, and that Mr. Watson had a sexual purpose, not just a therapeutic purpose, in making these arrangements with these particular therapists. That is just a little bit of what she found in the readings. I encourage you to go out there and read the rest of it there, because it really goes in depth on what Judge Sue L. Robinson found in some of these the hearings here. But to me, I don't know how this plays out. I would guess, like you mentioned, 12. Maybe they come up with a settlement. But if there's no settlement, I doubt we see Watson on the field this year. At least I don't think he's going to end up playing this year. But we'll see how this unfolds later on in court. It's something that we're going to be talking about quite a bit here, as now we're going through the appeal process, and that's going to kick into maybe going to federal court, depending on what the NFLPA decides to do. Thanks for watching the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi. And for more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to VSiN Live and the GM Shuffle podcast with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN, wherever you get your podcasts.